Most of the cities I work in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, have very large populations at risk from storms and floods. It's common for 60% of the population to live in informal or illegal settlements. This isn't just poor small cities. This is cities as wealthy as Mumbai. Half the population lives in informal settlements. Or Nairobi, half the population lives in informal settlements. A very high proportion of these informal settlements are on dangerous sites, floodplains, steep slopes. This is the only land that low-income groups can actually get access to. All the safe sites are denied them. As I mentioned earlier, it's common for drainage networks to cover less than a half of a city's population. And of course, you cannot adapt to climate change unless you have the basic protective infrastructure in place. But many governments refuse to work with those living in informal settlements, even as they represent half the population, even as they provide most of the cheap labor force, even as they provide many of the enterprises on which the city economy depends. Of course, if a government isn't prepared to talk to those in informal settlements, to work with them for conventional infrastructure, water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools, they're not going to talk to them about reducing risks from climate change. So it's misleading to see the solution as increased funding. What is needed is increased funding, increased competence in local government, capacity and transparency. But reforming local government is a slow, politically contested process. It took many decades in Europe and North America to go from weak, incapacitated, incapable local governments to local governments with the capacity to protect all those within their boundaries. There's also a massive underestimation of the cost of adaptation. The UNFCCC costings ignores the cost of addressing the deficits. They base their cost estimates for modifying infrastructure on the cost of existing infrastructure to which you add the modification. It seems to have escaped their notice that you can't modify infrastructure that isn't there. The role of mitigation. Many low-income nations have such low greenhouse gas emissions that there isn't much to mitigate. Will mitigation take attention away from adaptation? At present for cities, it is doing exactly that. Indeed, there's more international programs to support low-income nations to develop mitigation programs in their cities than to support adaptation. The Copenhagen Accord wording makes it possible to steer most new international funding to mitigation, not to adaptation. And of course, the rich nations' self-interest is to push mitigation in low-income nations to reduce their need to reduce emissions. There isn't much synergy between adaptation and mitigation in low-income nations. Again, as I said, the emissions per person are so low, there isn't much to mitigate. So, as my final slide, we've got the urgent task to build adaptive capacity in 50,000 urban centres, also, of course, in all rural areas. I don't think the Copenhagen Accord advanced this much. We need this adaptive capacity to work with the reduction of risks in other environmental hazards, so that funding for adaptation has also got to be funding for development, funding for environmental health risk reduction, funding for disaster preparedness. These are all integrated and linked to each other. You cannot separate them. We need it to be strongly pro-poor, focusing on those most at risk. It's got to build on the knowledge on how to reduce risk from disasters. It's a little disappointing that the discussion of adapting cities to climate change forgets to draw on the vast body of knowledge over the last 30 years on disaster risk reduction. There's enormous co-benefits between the two. We've got to build a strong local knowledge base on climate variability and the likely local impacts from climate change. In most cities, there is no such knowledge base. We need to get action now, in part because the risks are so evident, but in part because it takes a long time to change the infrastructure or develop the infrastructure of a city so that over time it becomes more resilient. You need your investment program now to be thinking with a 10, 20, 30, 50-year risk horizon. Of course, the core of all this is building the competence and accountability of local government, changing their relationship with those working in informal settlements. There are good precedents in some countries, but not many. Getting local governments to see the contributions of individuals, households, and community organizations to adaptation, as well as enterprises. Obviously, this needs complementary roles from higher levels of government. Of course, urban areas need resilience and adaptation built in rural areas too. This is where they get their food, many of their raw materials, also a lot of the demand for the goods and services. Of course, you can build the above into a mitigation framework, but it's really only in the successful cities and the successful economies that this is possible. And then finally, I have the world's most unlikely recommendation in terms of being accepted. I want the UNFCCC to change its name to the UNFCCC CCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for catalyzing change in countries, cities, and communities. Thank you.